Through the Desert by Henryk Sienkiewicz. If you appreciate my work, leave a trace in the comments. Chapter 20. Before Staś and the young Negro could dispose of the dead bodies of the Arabs and the carcass of the lion, the sun had nearly set, and night was approaching. But they could not possibly pass the night near the corpses, and although Kali, stroking his chest and stomach with his hand, pointed to the dead lion as he smacked his lips, and repeated, "Memsuri, nyama, good meat." Staś would not permit him to touch the nyama, but told him to catch the horses which had run away at the report of the guns. The black boy executed this order very cleverly, for instead of following them into the valley, in which case they would have continued to run further away, he climbed up the side of the hill and so took a short cut across corners and headed off the frightened animals. In this manner, he caught 2 of them easily, and the other 2 he drove towards Staś. But Gebhr's and Chamis' horses could not be found. Besides these, there remained 4 saddle horses, not counting the mule which carried the tent and the baggage, and which had been very calm throughout all these tragical events. The donkey was found behind a corner quietly grazing on the grass that grew in the bottom of the valley. The Sudan horses are quite accustomed to the sight of wild animals, though they are afraid of lions. Therefore it took a great deal of persuasion to induce them to pass the rock and the pool of blood. The horses neighed, snorted, and drew their heads back at the sight of the blood-stained stones. But no sooner did the donkey prick up his ears and pass by quietly than they followed. Though night had now begun to fall, they walked on for a while, and only stopped on reaching a place where the valley narrowed once more into a small amphitheater, mostly covered with thorns and prickly mimosa bushes. "Sir," said the young Negro, "Kali will make a large fire." And he took a broad Sudanese sword which he had removed from Gebhr's corpse and used it to cut down the thorns and large bushes. After he lighted the fire, he continued to chop wood until he had a sufficient amount to last through the night. Then he and Staś began to set up on the steep side of the valley a small tent for Nell, which they enclosed with a broad and high prickly hedge shaped like a half-moon, or with a so-called zariba. Staś knew from descriptions given by African travelers that they are thus able to protect themselves against the onslaughts of wild animals. But there was not enough room behind the hedge for the horses, and therefore the boys removed the saddles, harnesses, and bags from the animals, and only tied their feet, so that when searching for grass and water, they would not stray away too far. In fact, water was to be found quite near, in a crevice of a rock which formed a small basin under the opposite boulder. There was enough to quench the thirst of the horses, and some to spare for the following morning in which to cook the birds Chamis had shot. And in the baggage which the donkey carried, in addition to the tent, there were found some corn, a little salt, and a bundle of dried manioc roots, which were sufficient for a substantial meal. But only Kali and Mia had any appetite. The young Negro, who had been half-starved by Gebhr, ate enough for 2. He was more than grateful to his new masters, and directly after the meal he fell down on his face before Staś and Nell, to denote that he would remain their slave until his dying day. And he also showed great respect for Staś's rifle, possibly with the correct idea that it would be safer to obtain in advance the goodwill of such a powerful weapon. Then he declared that he would take turns with Mia watching over the great man and the bibi while they slept, and that he would also see that the fire did not go out. Then he immediately squatted down in front of them, crossed his legs, and hummed a little tune, in which he invariably repeated the refrain, "Simba Kufa, which in the Kiswahili language means, "The lion is dead." But neither the great man nor the small bibi felt sleepy, and Staś had to coax Nell before he could induce her to taste a little of the bird and a few grains of the boiled corn. She said she could neither eat nor sleep, and that she only wanted a drink. Staś was afraid she was getting the fever, but he was soon convinced to the contrary, as even her hands were cold. He was eventually able to induce her to go into the tent, where he had arranged a place for her to lie down, after having at first carefully looked to see if there were any scorpions in the grass. As for him, he sat down on a stone with his rifle on his arm, to guard her from an onslaught of wild animals, in case the fire should prove insufficient protection. He was overcome by fatigue and greatly exhausted, and repeated to himself over and over again, "I have killed Geber and Chamas and the Bedouins. I have killed a lion, and we are free." But he felt as though someone else were whispering these words to him, and that he could not comprehend their meaning. He only knew that they were free, and at the same time something terrible had happened, which filled him with uneasiness and pressed like a heavy weight on his chest. At last his thoughts became indistinct. For a while he gazed at the moth which hovered over the flame, and at last he began to nod and doze. Kali, too, was napping, but awoke every now and then and threw branches into the fire. The night was dark, and, what is very unusual near the equator, very quiet. Nothing could be heard but the crackling of the burning thorns and the flickering of the flames as they lighted up the promontories of the cliffs, which formed a half-circle. The moon did not shine into the interior of the gorge, but millions of strange stars twinkled. The air had become so cold that Staś awoke, sleepy and chilly, and he was alarmed lest the cold might harm little Nell. However, he was reassured when he remembered that he had left for her, on the rug in the tent, the shawl which Dinah had taken away from Fayoum. He also remembered that they had unknowingly been riding uphill from the time they quitted the banks of the Nile, and that consequently now, after several days of travel, they ought to be fairly high up, so as to be beyond any danger from fever, which infested the land by the river. The penetrating chilliness of the night seemed to substantiate his opinion. This thought gave him courage. He entered the tent for a moment to hear if Nell was sleeping peacefully. Then he returned, settled down nearer the fire, and began to doze once more, and in fact soon fell fast asleep. Suddenly Saba, who had stretched himself out to sleep at his feet, aroused him by growling. Kali awoke also, and both began to look anxiously at the dog. He lay there tense as the string of a bow, pricking up his ears, with dilated nostrils, sniffing the air, and staring into the darkness in the direction from which they had come. The hair on his neck and his back stood on end, his chest expanded with his heavy breathing, and he growled. The young slave hurriedly threw some branches on the fire. "Sir," he whispered, "take your gun! Take your gun!" Staś took up his rifle and crouched in front of the fire so that he could get a better view of the dark bend of the gorge. Saba's growls changed into a short bark. For a little while there was no sound. Then from a distance Kali and Staś heard a dull tramping, as though large animals were running toward the fire. This tramping resounded through the night, echoed from cliff to cliff, and increased every second. Staś felt that great danger was approaching, but what could it be? Perhaps buffaloes or a couple of rhinoceroses trying to find their way out of the gorge. In this case, if the report of a shot were not successful in frightening them and causing them to retrace their steps, nothing could save the caravan, for these animals are just as vicious and liable to attack one as animals of prey, and they have no fear of fire, and destroy everything that comes in their way. But what if it were a division of Smain's expedition, which, after having discovered the corpse in the gorge, was hunting for the murderer? Staś could not make up his mind as to which would be the better, a quick death or to be put in prison again. At the same time it occurred to him that if Smain himself happened to be in this division, he would most likely spare them, but if he were not there, the dervishes would either murder them at once, or, which would be still worse, torture them terribly before putting them to death. "Oh," thought he, "let us pray that they are animals and not human beings." Meanwhile, the tramping increased and changed into the clatter of hoofs, until at last out of the darkness appeared fiery eyes, dilated nostrils, and manes disheveled from running. "Horses!" exclaimed Kali. These were really Geber's and Chamas's horses. They came running at a wild gallop, obviously driven on by fright, but as they rushed into the light and saw their captive friends, they reared, neighed, pawed the ground with their hoofs, and then for a while stood motionless. Staś did not remove his gun from his shoulder. He was sure that behind the horses the disheveled head of a lion or the flat skull of a leopard might appear at any minute. But he waited in vain. The horses gradually quieted down, and what was more important, Saba stopped sniffing and stretching himself out after the manner of dogs, turned round and round on the same spot, curled up and closed his eyes. If animals of prey had chased the horses, it was evident that they had slowly turned back on smelling the smoke or seeing the firelight reflected on the rocks. At any rate, something must have frightened them very much, said Staś to Kali, because they were not afraid to run past the corpses of the men and lion. Sir, answered the boy, Kali imagines what has happened. A great many hyenas and jackals have entered the gorge to reach the corpses. The horses have run away from them, and the hyenas did not pursue them because they were devouring Geber and the others. That may be, but go now and take the saddles off the horses and bring the harnesses and the water bags here. Do not be afraid, the gun will protect you. Kali not afraid, said the boy, and as he pushed aside some of the thorns that were next to the cliffs, he stole out of the hedge, and at the same time Nell stepped out of the tent. Saba arose at once, sniffed at her, and expected the customary caress. At first she stretched out her hand, but drew it back immediately, thoroughly disgusted. Staś, what has happened? Said she. Nothing. Those 2 horses came running up here. Did their tramping awaken you? I was awake before, and was just going to leave the tent, but what? I thought you would be angry? Angry with you? Nell raised her eyes and gazed at him with a very peculiar expression, an expression he had never seen before. Over Staś's face then passed a look of surprise, for from her words and looks he saw that she was terrified. She is afraid of me, thought he, and for a moment he even felt quite satisfied. Then he thought that after all he had accomplished, even Nell, who did not think of him merely as a full-grown man, but also as a terrible warrior who inspires everyone with fear, should look up at him and caress him. But this feeling of elation did not last long, for his sad experience had taught him to observe closely, and so he noticed that the girl's restless eyes denoted not only fear, but a certain repugnance, because of what had occurred, in consequence of the blood that had been shed, and the horrors that she had witnessed this very day. He also immediately remembered that a moment ago she had withdrawn her hand so as to avoid stroking Saba, for it was who had killed one of the Bedouins. Yes, that was the reason. And did not Staś himself feel it pressing like a nightmare on his chest? It was one thing to read at Port Said about the American trappers who killed the red-skinned Indians by the dozens in the Wild West, and another thing to do likewise one's self, and to see men who were alive a short time before expiring in their last bloody agony. Yes, certainly Nell is very much terrified, and she will always continue to have that feeling of repugnance. I am sure that she will fear me, thought Staś, but in her heart of hearts she will unconsciously never forget to think ill of what I have done, and that is to be my reward for all I have done for her. His heart was bowed down by these thoughts, because he knew very well that if it were not for Nell, he would have been killed or have fled long ago. Therefore it was for her sake that he had suffered so much hunger and pain, which only resulted in her standing there frightened, changed, entirely different from the little sister she was before, and who now raised her eyes to his with the old confiding look gone, and in its stead an expression of intense fear. Staś suddenly felt very unhappy. For the first time in his life he realized what it was to be moved. Unconsciously the tears started to his eyes, and if it had not been for the fact that it was not at all the proper thing for a fierce warrior to weep, he would most likely have done so. But he controlled himself, turned to the girl, and asked, "Nell, are you afraid?" And she answered softly, "It is really so terrible." Then Staś told Kali to bring the rugs that lay under the saddles, and after placing one of them over the stones on which he had dozed before, he stretched out the second one on the ground and said, "Sit down here by me near the fire. The night is cold, isn't it? If you are very sleepy, rest your little head on me and go to sleep." And Nell could only answer, "It is really too dreadful." Staś wrapped her up tenderly and carefully in the shawl, and then they sat there silently for a while, leaning against each other, and illuminated by the ruddy firelight, which flickered on the rocks and shone on the mica scales that studded the slope of the cliff. From the other side of the hedge, the neighing of the horses could be heard, and now and again the sound of munching as they chewed the grass between their teeth. "Listen, Nell," began Staś. "I was obliged to do what I did, If the lion had not been satisfied in going for Kali, but had followed our party instead, Geber threatened to stab us. Do you understand? Now remember that he did not only threaten me, but you also, and he would have executed his threat too. I will frankly tell you that if this threat had not been made, I would not have shot them even when I did, though I had long contemplated it. I believe I would not have done it otherwise. But Geber drove me to the limit. Did you see how he tortured Kali and Camus? How in the meanest way he betrayed us and sold us? But have you the least idea what would have happened if they had not found Smain? Geber would then have continually tortured me as well as you. It is awful to think that he beat you daily with the currycomb, and would have tortured us both slowly to death, and after our deaths would have returned to Fashoda and said that we had died of the fever. Nell, I did not do it to be cruel, but I had to think of how I could save you. I was only troubled on your account. And in his face there were many traces of the sadness that filled his heart. Nell saw and understood this clearly, for she drew up closer to him. But he fought against the momentary emotion and continued, I shall certainly not change, and I shall protect and guide you as before. But as long as they were alive, there was no hope of delivery. Now we can flee to Abyssinia. The Abyssinians are black and savage, but are Christians and are also enemies of the dervishes. If you keep well, we shall succeed, as it is not very far to Abyssinia. And even if we should not succeed, even if we should fall into Smain's hands, do not fear that he will take revenge on us. He has never in his life seen Geber or the Bedouins. He has seen Chamis only, but what has Chamis to do with him? In fact, we must not even tell Smain that Chamis was with us. If we succeed in reaching Abyssinia, we are saved, and if not, even then, you would be better off than now, for surely there are no more monsters like these in the world. Nell, dear, don't be afraid of me. And to gain her confidence and at the same time encourage her, he began to stroke her golden hair. The girl listened, at the same time raising her eyes shyly to his, for it was evident that she wanted to say something, but held back, hesitated, and felt afraid to speak. At last she bent her little head down so far that her hair completely hid her tiny face, and in even softer tones than before she said, Staś, dear! What, my dearest? And they will not return? Who? Asked Staś, surprised. Those the killed. Nell, what are you saying? I am frightened, I am afraid. And her pale lips began to tremble. Silence reigned. Staś did not believe that the dead could return to life, but as it was night and their corpses lay quite near, he did feel a little uneasy. Cold chills went down his back. Nell, what are you saying? He repeated. Dinah must have taught you to be afraid of the spirits of the dead. He did not finish the sentence, because at this moment something terrible happened. Suddenly, through the dead silence of the night, there rang forth from out the depths of the gorge, from the place where the dead bodies lay, an extraordinary, unearthly, terrible laughter, betokening despair, joy, cruelty, sorrow, sobs, and derision, the convulsive, spasmodic laughter of a lunatic or of a condemned man. Nell shrieked and flung her arms round Staś, and his hair stood on end. Saba got up suddenly and began to growl. But Kali alone, who was quietly sitting near them, raised his head calmly and said reassuringly, The hyenas are laughing over Geber and the lion.
Remember to subscribe.